In this video, I'm going to show you step by step how to make a Native American Hupa style arrow with a bone barb and a stone point. I consider this one of the most complicated to make and wicked style arrows in history. Detailed drawings of this arrow can be found on page 188 in the first volume of the Traditional Bowyer's Bible. You can also see pictures of the original arrow in the University of Missouri's anthropology website. This particular style of Hupa arrow had a removable barbed foreshaft that held the stone point. This foreshaft was made out of bone. For this project, I'm going to use the leg bone of an elk. The primitive Stone Age method of making tools out of bone was to grind it down using sandstone or coarse rock till you had the desired shape. This, however, takes a very long time, so for this project, I'm going to use my foot-powered grinder that I made. After shaping the narrow tang that fits inside our main arrow shaft, and the flat part that will hold our stone point, I began forming the barbs using a file. I used a small flat file to form the groove that would hold a stone point on the tip of the arrow, and also used it to shave down the tang so that it would easily fit into the main arrow shaft. Now that this bone foreshaft has been ground down to the desired shape, I'm ready to start knapping the stone point. The original Hupa arrow had a small triangular arrowhead that was knapped out of red jasper. Since I don't have any red jasper with me, I'm going to be using red obsidian. The first step in making an arrowhead is to take your core rock and strike off flakes using a hammerstone. Then, when you have a good flake, you start shaping it into a biface using percussion from a deer antler. You strike flakes from the edge to remove high spots until your biface is evenly worked and has an established center line around the piece. This is the biface in which we will make the stone point for our Hupa arrow. The next step is to really grind the edges smooth to develop platforms from which you can strike flakes to thin the piece. Here you can see a platform that is sitting below center line that will produce a really nice flake when hit with a precise blow. You continue to remove flakes with this method until your piece is thin and the general shape you want for your arrowhead. You are then ready to start pressure flaking with an antler tine. The key to pressure flaking is to really grind and develop good platforms. Then place your antler tine on the edge of the piece and apply equal pressure in and down until you cleanly remove a flake. Repeat this process on both sides of the piece until your flakes become thinner and start running in a downward angle parallel to each other. Now that we have a good flaking pattern along the cutting edges of the arrowhead, we are ready to pressure flake the bottom to get our desired triangle shape. The arrowhead turned out very thin, however it didn't quite fit in the groove we made in our bone foreshaft, so I made a notch at the base of the arrowhead. Now the arrowhead fits well with our bone foreshaft, and the last step is to chip the side notches, which will hold the sinew lashing. With the stone point and the bone foreshaft complete, the next step is to paint it like the original Hupa arrow. The bone foreshaft was originally painted black. A commonly used black pigment is charcoal, which can be ground into a powder. Here I'm going to use charcoal mixed with modern paint. The final piece will be solid black with an unpainted white line located just below where the arrowhead sits in the foreshaft. We are now ready to work on the main arrow shaft, which I'll make out of a hardwood shoot known as ocean spray, also known as arrowwood. I have already let this main arrow shaft season for several months and then straightened it with heat, so the next step is to remove the bark using a sharp piece of obsidian. Once all the bark has been scraped away, I cut the arrow to length by scoring around the shaft with a sharp piece of obsidian and then applying even pressure until it breaks. For the final step in smoothing the main arrow shaft, I will use the traditional method of using a plant called horsetail rush or scour rush. This plant has silica in the plant walls, which when dried and rubbed along wood, produces an effect much like sandpaper. I'll also use the lateral lines in this plant stem to carve in several grooves at the base of the arrow where the fletching will go. This will help glue on the feather with the sinew wrapping. The next step is to carve out the nock for the bowstring using a sharp piece of obsidian. The original Hupa arrow had a very shallow V-shaped nock. With the nock complete, we can now carve out a hole in the tip of the main arrow shaft to receive our bow and foreshaft. Traditionally, this was done with a bone or stone drill, but for this project I'm going to use a nail that has been flattened and filed to a sharp edge. I secured the nails upright in a stump and then began drilling out the main shaft using the same method I would to make a hand fire drill. Work slowly and carefully drill out the hole in the main arrow shaft. As the hole gets bigger, the main arrow shaft will want to split. You can avoid this problem by wrapping the tip of the arrow shaft with natural cordage. However, I'm not too worried about it since we will later wrap this with a sinew wrapping. Continue to drill out the hole until the bone foreshaft fits snugly into the main arrow shaft. We are then ready to paint the main shaft to match the colors of the original Hupa arrow. Start by painting 6 black lines above the nock where the fletchings will go. In between each set of black lines was a red line that was traditionally painted out of red ochre pigment that was crushed into a fine powder. Here I'm going to use red ochre pigment that has been mixed with modern paint. Now that the red and black lines have been painted, it's time to fletch the arrow. The original Hupa arrow had black fletchings, so for this arrow I'm going to use the feathers of a Canada goose. Begin by stripping the lower fibers off the feather. Next I use a sharp piece of obsidian to split and remove the quill. You can then cut your feather to length to fit the fletchings of your arrow. At this point the feather fibers are too long, so I use a sharp blade of obsidian and a piece of wood to trim them down. This is just a rough cut. I will finish shaping them after the feather fletchings have been attached to the main arrow shaft. The next step is to scrape down the base of the split quill to remove any of the soft pithy material and to cut away any of the jagged edges. Once this is done, the feathers are ready to glue onto the main arrow shaft. When attaching the fletchings, I like to first secure the front of the feather to the main arrow shaft by wrapping them with wet sinew. For this project, I'm going to use the thin fibers of sinew you get from the long tendons running along the back of an elk. Sinew was a very common material used in making primitive arrows. Before wrapping the arrow, the thin fiber of sinew must first be wet. The traditional method of preparing sinew was to chew it in your mouth to allow the saliva to soften the sinew. Next, add a little hide glue to the arrow shaft and wrap the front of the 3 feather fletchings into their proper place with the strands of wet sinew. As this wet sinew dries, it forms a very tight bond. After about 10 minutes, I apply more hide glue to the base of each of the 3 feather fletchings. I then wrap a thin piece of thread along the feathers to temporarily hold them in place while the glue is drying. The biggest advantage of the thread wrappings is while the glue is still wet, you can adjust the feathers so that they're in proper alignment for good arrow flight. When the glue is dry, simply pull away the thread from the feather fibers. You are then ready to secure the back of the fletchings using more sinew wrapping. Now that the feather fletchings are attached, we are ready to sinew wrap the foreshaft on the front of the arrow. Securely wrapping the joint between the foreshaft and the main shaft keeps the foreshaft in proper alignment and prevents the main shaft from splitting out when it is shot into its intended target. Next, we will secure the stone point to the bone foreshaft by wrapping sinew fibers around the base of the arrowhead and then crossing up and back around the 2 side notches. Again, as that wet sinew dries, it shrinks, really holding that stone point in place. You can also add pine pitch glue to the base of the arrowhead before sinew wrapping it to really secure it to the foreshaft. Now that the sinew wrapping is complete, we are ready to paint the rest of the arrow. On the original Hupa arrow, the sinew wrapping at the base of the foreshaft was painted red. The sinew wrapping on the feather fletchings were dyed blue using laundry bluing. Native American arrows from the late 1800s were often decorated blue using this method. The final step to completing this arrow is to finish trimming the long feather fibers on the fletchings. I did this by using a sharp piece of obsidian and then running the feathers along a flame to clean up any of the loose ends. Now we have a finished example of a Hupa style arrow with a bone barbed foreshaft and a stone point. If you like learning how to make historical primitive style arrows, check out some of my other videos. I have lots of videos on how to make different styles of arrows from different time periods.